90s Retro Return.
Anyone who watched cartoons in the 90s probably remembers seeing a ton of commercials for board games. There were a lot of memorable ones, like games for Mousetrap, Guess Who, Hungry Hippos, Crossfire, and Fireball Island, but those games were actually all created before the 90s, and they were still just being advertised at that point. Apparently most of the games I played as a kid, they were all from the 80s or earlier, so I wanted to take a look at some truly 90s games. For Christmas of 1989, I got the game Thin Ice, where the objective was to take turns placing wet marbles onto a sheet of tissue paper and try not to have the marbles fall through the quote-unquote ice. The commercial for the game used the song Wipeout, but added its own lyrics on top of it about being on thin ice. In 1990, commercials for the game Crocodile Dentist were being aired. The game was sort of like a kid's version of Russian roulette, where they would take turns either extracting a tooth on earlier models or pushing a tooth down of a plastic crocodile's mouth. Randomly, someone would trigger the mechanism, and the crocodile would slam its mouth shut and lunge forward. On the earlier versions where they used pliers, it wasn't a big deal, it would just kind of lunge towards you, but on later versions when you would push the tooth down, it would slam shut on your finger. The hope was, of course, that you left your finger where it was in the gap and it didn't get pinched, but you can only imagine the amount of crying and screaming children in the 90s because of this toy. In 1991, the electronic Dream Phone debuted, which was a game that came with a plastic phone where you could dial numbers. When you would call a number, a clue would be revealed about one of the 24 boys featured in the game. The goal was to use your deductive reasoning to discover which of the boys had a crush on you before the other players did. It was designed as a multiplayer game, but because of how it functioned, you could actually play it by yourself as well. In the game Don't Wake Daddy from 1992, children would try to sneak to the refrigerator for a midnight snack while trying not to wake up the sleeping father. If a player landed on a space that showed something noisy, like a barking dog, and they didn't have a matching card, they'd have to push a little button on an alarm clock. Like Crocodile Dentist, the mechanism was random, and some unlucky player would trigger a plastic father who popped up out of bed, and the player would have to go back to the start of the game. 1993's 13 Dead End Drive was a murder-themed board game about a wealthy old woman who passed away, and it caused a feud over her will. Players would set up traps to try to kill the other players on a 3D playing board to try to become the last living heir of her fortune. It was kind of a weird premise for a children's game, but it was the 90s, so I guess teaching kids to drop chandeliers on each other to get rich was just normal back then. Also in 1993, one of the biggest card games to this day debuted, which was Magic the Gathering. It was released by Wizards of the Coast as the company's first trading card game, and they were the ones responsible for creating the modern-day trading card game model of randomized decks, deck building, expansions, and tournaments. In the game, 2 or more players duel as powerful wizards, and they try to reduce their opponent's starting life from 20 down to 0. Returning to the wacky genre, Gooey Louie came out in 1995, where players would take turns pulling gooeys, or boogers, out of Louie's nose. The goal was to avoid picking out the booger that was attached to the trigger mechanism, which made his eyes pop out and his brain fly off. You may be noticing a common theme of 90s board games trying to jump scare kids. By 1996, the Pokémon Trading Card Game had been published in Japan by Media Factory, with worldwide publishing being handled by the Pokémon Company. In the United States, the game was originally licensed to Wizards of the Coast, who were the producers of Magic the Gathering, but later on it was transferred to the Pokémon Company. The Pokémon Trading Card Game is estimated at a value over $75 billion to this day, and the overall franchise has generated over $115 billion in lifetime revenue. Finally, by the end of the 90s, we got games like Cranium. Cranium was created by Microsoft executives Richard Tate and Whit Alexander, and instead of relying on toy store distribution, it initially launched through places like Starbucks, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon. The founders would personally deliver boxes to Starbucks when the stores would run out of stock. To play, players would divide into teams and take turns trying to complete challenges like drawing clues or sculpting clues in clay, answering trivia questions, or doing word scrambles. What were some of your favorite board games or board game commercials of the 90s? Comment below and let me know, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos where I return to 90s retro pop culture.